There's one habit I want to tell you about today, just one, that I think explains something considerably bigger than money itself once you actually sit with it for a while. It explains why my grandmother, raising 4 children through years I can only imagine were financially harder in real, concrete ways than most of what my own generation has ever had to face, never once seemed to panic about money, not that I ever witnessed, not that anyone in the family ever described afterward when the stories got told at holiday tables. Not visibly, not in front of the children, not in any account anyone in the family ever passed down about her. And once I actually understood the real mechanism sitting behind that calm, I realized it had almost nothing to do with how much money she actually had at any given moment, and everything to do with one small notebook she kept on a shelf beside the kitchen telephone. She wrote down every single dollar, in and out, by hand, in a plain composition notebook with a soft, worn cover gone thin from years of steady use, the kind you'd find in a school supply aisle, rather than anything fancy or specifically designed for the purpose. A notebook that could just as easily have held a child's homework as a family's entire financial history. Every grocery trip, every bill paid, every dollar earned that particular week, down to the cent. Nothing rounded off for convenience. Nothing skipped, nothing estimated roughly and left comfortably vague, nothing left entirely to memory and hoped for the best on a busy week when sitting down felt like the last thing she wanted to do. She sat down with it every single Sunday evening without fail, added up the week's total by hand with a pencil worn down to a stub over the years, and knew, with complete total certainty, exactly where the family actually stood financially. No guessing involved at any point in the process. I used to think this was simply an old-fashioned habit, something that made sense before banks offered an app that could show you your balance instantly with a single tap, a relic from a time before technology made the whole exercise unnecessary. That's honestly what I assumed, for years, until I actually sat down and thought honestly about what panic really is, psychologically speaking, and where it actually comes from in a person's mind. Panic isn't usually caused by bad news itself, and this took me a long time to actually understand properly. It's caused by uncertainty, plainly, by not knowing something specific, by a real gap between what you fear might secretly be true and what you can actually confirm is true with your own eyes. A frightening number you can see clearly and understand completely, sitting right there on the page in front of you, is something you can actually plan around, adjust for, respond to sensibly. A frightening number you can only guess at, that might be considerably worse than you think, that you're actively avoiding checking because you're afraid of what you might actually find if you looked. That's the version that truly produces panic. The racing thoughts at 2 a.m, the sudden stomach drop feeling when an unexpected bill arrives in the mail and you truly don't know if you can cover it. My grandmother never had that particular gap because she closed it every single week, deliberately, on purpose, in the same notebook, at the same kitchen table, with the same cup of tea sitting beside her elbow. There was no version of her own finances she was quietly avoiding looking at, no drawer she dreaded opening. There was no vague dread sitting in the back of her mind about a number she hadn't checked in weeks and was putting off checking. She knew, plainly and completely, every single Sunday, and that knowledge itself, entirely regardless of whether the number happened to be good or difficult that particular week, was precisely what kept the panic from ever taking hold in the first place. I started keeping my own notebook this year, an actual physical one, not an app that would let me scroll past without truly registering any of it, sitting down every Sunday evening the same way she had, writing out the entire week by hand with an actual pen. The first few Sundays were uncomfortable in a way I honestly hadn't expected going in, my hand feeling strangely out of practice at something this simple. I realized, with something close to real embarrassment, how many weeks I'd gone without actually knowing my own numbers clearly, relying instead on a vague, comfortable sense that things were probably fine, a feeling I'd never once actually sat down and verified with any real rigor. By the 4th or 5th Sunday, something had shifted in a way that truly surprised me. I wasn't dreading the notebook anymore, the way I had the first couple of weeks, half wanting to skip it. I was almost looking forward to it instead, the same way you eventually look forward to a task that used to feel heavy and has slowly, quietly become simply routine, woven into the shape of the week without much thought required. And more importantly than the routine itself, the specific anxious feeling I used to get whenever an unexpected bill arrived, that sudden lurch of not knowing whether I could actually cover it without checking 3 different accounts first, had mostly disappeared entirely. I already knew. I'd checked deliberately every single week without fail, and there was simply no gap left anywhere for that particular fear to hide in anymore. I think this is the part most people miss when they hear a story like my grandmother's and assume it was simply about being careful with money in some general sense, or naturally disciplined, or frugal by temperament rather than by deliberate practice. It wasn't really about any of that at all, not at its core. It was about eliminating the specific gap between what she knew and what she quietly feared, on purpose, every single week without exception, so there was never a version of her own financial reality she was actively avoiding. The real discipline wasn't in spending less, though that sometimes followed naturally enough. The discipline was in looking, consistently and honestly, at something most of us would honestly rather avoid checking too closely. If you try this yourself, and I'd truly encourage you to give it a real month before deciding whether it's actually for you, here's the one thing I'd tell you before you even start. Don't do it on your phone, and don't do it through an app that summarizes everything neatly for you in a colorful chart you can glance at and dismiss. Write it by hand, the actual numbers, the actual total, the same way she did at that same kitchen table decades ago. There's something about the physical act of writing a number down yourself, watching it add up in your own handwriting, rather than calculated instantly by something else, that creates a kind of real ownership over the information an app's tidy summary simply can't replicate, no matter how well designed it is. You're not just glancing at your finances. You're actually confronting them, deliberately, every single week, the same way she did, without ever once calling it anything grander than Sunday. I still check my accounts on my phone throughout the week, and I'm not suggesting anyone abandon modern convenience entirely or throw away a perfectly useful tool. But that one weekly Sunday habit, the notebook, the pen, the honest total written out plainly in my own hand, has done more for how calm I actually feel about money on an ordinary day than any budgeting app I've ever downloaded with real enthusiasm and eventually abandoned within a few discouraging weeks. The panic was never really about the numbers themselves, whatever they happened to be that week. It was about not knowing them clearly. And once you know, plainly and completely, every single week without fail, there's simply nothing left anywhere for the panic to actually attach itself to.